November 1968, the Atlantic Undersea Test and Evaluation Center in Barbados, a facility that most visitors to the Caribbean island never know exists, operating in classified status throughout the Cold War, monitoring acoustic data collected from hydrophone arrays positioned on the ocean floor hundreds of miles offshore. Inside the facility's operations center, Ocean Systems Technician Second Class James Mitchell sits at a console displaying multiple screens, showing acoustic data represented as spectrograms, visual representations of sound where frequency appears on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis with intensity indicated by color or brightness. Mitchell has been monitoring these displays for 6 hours into his 8-hour watch, observing the constant background of ocean ambient noise created by waves, marine life, shipping, and geological activity. At 0347 hours, a new signature appears on his displays, faint at first, but with characteristic patterns that his training allows him to recognize immediately. The signature shows narrow band energy at specific frequencies, 50 Hz, 100 Hz, 150 Hz, harmonically related frequencies that indicate machinery operating at fixed rotational speeds. The fundamental frequency at 50 Hz suggests a reactor coolant pump operating at 3,000 revolutions per minute. Additional energy at higher frequencies shows reduction gear whine, the sound created as mechanical gears transfer power from turbines to propeller shafts. The signature is unmistakably artificial. No natural ocean sound creates this pattern of harmonically related frequencies at these specific values. Mitchell cross-references the signature against his classification guides, notebooks containing acoustic characteristics of known submarine types, and identifies the contact as a Soviet November-class nuclear submarine. The first nuclear-powered submarine class the Soviet Union deployed entering service in 1958 and still operational in 1968, though being superseded by newer Victor-class boats. Mitchell checks his displays for signal strength and bearing. The signal is faint, near the threshold of detectability, but the bearing is clear, northeast approximately 045 degrees from the Barbados array. He quickly calculates the geometry. The Barbados hydrophone array is positioned approximately 2,800 nautical miles southwest of the Kola Peninsula, where Soviet Northern Fleet bases are located. If this signature is actually a Soviet submarine departing those bases, it represents detection at extraordinary range, much farther than typical SOSUS detections, though not unprecedented under favorable acoustic conditions. Mitchell documents the detection in his log, recording time, bearing, frequency characteristics, and provisional classification. He immediately notifies his watch supervisor, who confirms the contact and initiates the reporting procedures that will pass this information through Navy communication channels to other SOSUS stations, to maritime patrol aircraft units, and to attack submarine forces that might be positioned to intercept. Over the next 12 hours, Mitchell and operators relieving him on subsequent watches track the Soviet submarine continuously as it transits westward. The P-3 crew deploys sonobuoy barriers 400 miles from the last SOSUS position update, creating lines of passive acoustic sensors that will detect the submarine as it passes. The sonobuoys pick up the submarine's signature within 30 minutes, confirming SOSUS tracking accuracy and allowing the P-3 to refine position to within 10 miles. The P-3 maintains contact for 8 hours, deploying additional sonobuoys as needed to keep track of the submarine as it continues westward into the Atlantic. Before the P-3 must depart due to fuel constraints, USS Permit, an American attack submarine that received transit orders based on SOSUS tracking data, arrives in the area and acquires the Soviet submarine on sonar at 30-mile range. Permit begins shadowing operations, following the Soviet boat quietly at distances, where Permit's sonar can track the Soviet submarine, but where the Soviet boat's sonar cannot detect Permit's presence. For the next 30 days, Permit follows the Soviet submarine throughout its patrol, gathering acoustic intelligence, monitoring operations, and demonstrating that American forces can track and follow Soviet submarines continuously once SOSUS provides initial detection. The Soviet submarine commander conducts his patrol believing that once he transited beyond the range where NATO forces could observe his departure, perhaps 200 miles from Soviet territorial waters, he entered vast ocean areas where detection was unlikely and continuous tracking impossible. He operates with standard Soviet procedures, maintaining reasonable depth, running quietly, minimizing sonar transmissions that might reveal his position, conducting his assigned patrol pattern, and eventually returning to base. When he surfaces 12 days after departure to transmit reports and receive updated orders, he has no indication that American forces have tracked him from departure through his entire patrol. Permit shadows him back to Soviet waters, and SOSUS tracks him as he approaches and eventually enters Kola Peninsula operating areas. From American perspective, this Soviet submarine's entire patrol was transparent, detected, tracked, followed, and monitored throughout without the Soviet crew ever suspecting the comprehensive surveillance they operated under. This scenario repeated thousands of times throughout the Cold War as SOSUS provided American and NATO forces with submarine surveillance capability that Soviet naval planners never adequately appreciated until it was too late to develop effective counters. To understand why SOSUS created such decisive advantages, you need to understand both the Soviet submarine threat that drove SOSUS development and the technology that made long-range underwater detection possible. The Soviet submarine threat that worried American naval planners throughout the 1950s and 1960s grew from the Soviet Union's massive investment in submarine forces. The Northern Fleet, based on the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk, operated more than 60 nuclear-powered submarines by the late 1960s, including ballistic missile submarines carrying strategic nuclear weapons and attack submarines designed to engage NATO naval forces. The Pacific Fleet, operating from Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, maintained more than 40 submarines, with similar mix of strategic and attack boats. Soviet strategy during potential NATO-Soviet conflict emphasized submarine operations against Atlantic supply lines that would sustain European allies and against American carrier strike groups that would provide air power in any conflict. Soviet doctrine assumed submarines would transit the GIUK gap, the relatively narrow ocean area between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, to reach the Atlantic, where they could interdict shipping and threaten NATO naval operations. Soviet confidence in submarine survivability relied on assumptions about ocean vastness providing natural concealment. The Atlantic Ocean measures more than 3,000 miles at its widest extent between North America and Europe, with average depth approaching 10,000 feet. A submarine operating at depth of 400-600 feet appears invisible to visual observation from surface ships or aircraft. Soviet planners believed that finding submarines in such enormous volumes of ocean would require NATO forces to essentially search randomly, with probability of detection too low to threaten the majority of Soviet submarine forces. Soviet submarines would operate quietly, minimizing acoustic signatures through reduced speed and silent running procedures, and the ocean would protect them through sheer scale of the search problem NATO forces faced. The submarine types Soviet forces deployed during the 1960s and 1970s reflected this confidence. The November-class nuclear submarine that entered service in 1958 was Soviet Union's first nuclear-powered submarine, providing underwater endurance that diesel-electric submarines couldn't match. The Victor class that followed beginning in 1967 incorporated improved acoustic quieting through better isolation of machinery and more sophisticated propeller designs. The Charlie class cruise missile submarine deployed from 1968 provided anti-surface capability against American carrier groups. Later designs, including Victor III and Akula class, incorporated progressively better quieting as Soviet engineers recognized acoustic signature importance, but early Soviet nuclear submarines operated with noise levels that made them detectable at substantial ranges under favorable conditions. Soviet doctrine envisioned these submarines breaking out into the Atlantic during the early stages of any NATO-Soviet conflict, reaching patrol areas where they could threaten NATO shipping and naval forces, and operating from protected Ost bastion areas during peacetime to preserve strategic ballistic missile submarines that would launch if conflict occurred. This doctrine assumed NATO could detect Soviet submarines near their departure points through local surveillance, patrol aircraft surface ships, attack submarines positioned near Soviet bases, but that once submarines transited several hundred miles from Soviet territory, they would become essentially undetectable in open ocean. What Soviet doctrine failed to adequately account for was the possibility that comprehensive sensor networks could track submarines continuously across thousands of miles of ocean. The sound surveillance system that would invalidate Soviet assumptions about ocean concealment began with Project Jezebel in 1949, when American naval researchers recognized that nuclear-powered submarines threatened American security in fundamentally new ways. Diesel-electric submarines needed to surface or snorkel frequently to recharge batteries, creating opportunities for detection. Nuclear submarines could remain submerged indefinitely, transiting entire oceans underwater without exposing themselves to visual detection. If Soviet nuclear submarines could operate undetected in approaches to American coasts, they could potentially threaten American cities, naval bases, and shipping with little warning. American planners recognized they needed detection systems that could identify submarine presence at long ranges, providing warning time necessary to respond. The solution researchers developed exploited basic physics of underwater sound propagation. Sound travels much farther underwater than in air because water is a denser medium that conducts sound efficiently. Under specific conditions, deep water with particular temperature and salinity profiles, sound can propagate hundreds or even thousands of miles with minimal attenuation. The key to exploiting this phenomenon lies in understanding the SOFAR channel, sound fixing and ranging channel, a naturally occurring acoustic waveguide that exists in all major oceans. The SOFAR channel forms because sound velocity in seawater varies with temperature, salinity, and pressure. Near the surface, water is relatively warm and sound velocity is high. As depth increases and temperature drops, sound velocity decreases. Below a certain depth, typically 600 to 100 meters depending on location and season, the The cooling effect on sound velocity is offset by increasing pressure, and sound velocity begins increasing again with depth. The depth where sound velocity reaches minimum creates acoustic channel, where sound waves that start in or near this depth become trapped through refraction. Sound waves traveling upward or downward from the channel axis bend back toward the axis through the velocity gradients, effectively confining the sound to the channel and allowing it to propagate enormous distances horizontally with minimal loss. SOSUS exploited the SOFAR channel by positioning hydrophone arrays at depths corresponding to the channel axis, ensuring maximum sensitivity to submarine-generated sounds, propagating through the channel. Each SOSUS array consisted of 300-plus individual hydrophone sensors, distributed across 5 to 50 miles of ocean floor, positioned along the continental shelf or slopes where installation was technically feasible. The hydrophones, essentially underwater microphones, converted acoustic pressure variations into electrical signals that cables transmitted to shore stations for processing and analysis. The Atlantic SOSUS barrier deployed during the 1960s created comprehensive coverage over strategic ocean areas where Soviet submarines would transit. The primary arrays stretched from Greenland to Iceland to monitor Northern Fleet submarine departures from Iceland to the United Kingdom to cover the GIUK gap itself, and from Newfoundland to the Azores to create a mid-Atlantic barrier that submarines passing through the GIUK gap would subsequently encounter. Each array fed acoustic data to shore stations, Naval Facility Keflavik in Iceland, Naval Facility Argentia in Newfoundland, the Atlantic Undersea Test and Evaluation Center in Barbados, and others, where Navy personnel operated around the clock monitoring and analyzing the data. The operators manning these facilities were ocean systems technicians, enlisted personnel specially trained in underwater acoustics, submarine signatures, and signal analysis. They monitored displays showing real-time acoustic data, looking for signatures that indicated submarine presence. Each Soviet submarine class produced unique acoustic signatures determined by specific machinery configurations, propeller designs, and hull characteristics. November-class submarines sounded different from Victor-class, which sounded different from Charlie-class, allowing trained operators to not only detect submarines, but classify them by type. Operators analyzed propeller blade, count-through blade rate frequencies, identified reactor coolant pump frequencies from narrow band lines in the signature, and detected reduction gear whine from mechanical power transmission systems. Computer processing systems fused data from multiple hydrophone arrays, calculating submarine positions, through triangulation from multiple bearing lines, estimating course and speed from position changes over time, and displaying tactical picture, showing submarine movements with 50 to 100 mile position accuracy updated every 10 to 30 minutes. This accuracy was sufficient to cue other anti-submarine warfare forces, maritime patrol aircraft, could deploy to areas where submarines were detected, and use sonobuoys to refine positions. Surface ships could establish patrol areas to intercept transiting submarines, and attack submarines could be vectored to positions where they could acquire Soviet boats on their own sonar and begin shadowing operations. The target handoff procedures that connected SOSUS to other anti-submarine warfare forces created a comprehensive surveillance system that Soviet submarines couldn't evade. SOSUS provided initial detection and tracking at long range, calculating submarine positions and movements with sufficient accuracy to direct other forces to intercept. P-3. Orion aircraft launched based on SOSUS data, deployed sonobuoy patterns that refined submarine positions to within 10 miles or less, and maintained contact while additional forces arrived. Attack submarines received vectoring from SOSUS, and P-3 data acquired Soviet submarines on their own sonar at ranges of 20 to 50 miles, depending on submarine noise levels, and shadowed quietly at distances where they could maintain contact without being detected themselves. The integrated system provided continuous tracking from initial SOSUS detection through prosecution by other forces, creating surveillance coverage that Soviet submarines simply couldn't escape. The reliability of SOSUS technology supported these sustained operations throughout 4 decades of Cold War tensions. The system operated 24 hours per day, 365 days per year, from the 1950s through the 1990s, with minimal maintenance requirements. The hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor contained solid-state electronics with no moving parts, creating robust systems that could operate for years without intervention. The cables transmitting data to shore stations were heavily armored against fishing gear, anchors, and other potential damage, and redundancy ensured that individual hydrophone failures didn't compromise array performance. Shore stations required regular maintenance on computers and displays, but overall system availability remained extremely high throughout the Cold War. The operational dominance SOSUS provided NATO forces shaped submarine warfare throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. A typical detection and tracking scenario followed patterns similar to the November-class submarine detection in November 1968. Soviet submarine departed Kola Peninsula bases, transiting on surface or shallow depth through coastal waters before diving to transit depth and heading westward toward the GIUK gap. SOSUS arrays positioned off the Norwegian coast detected the departure within 30 minutes to several hours, depending on acoustic conditions and submarine noise levels. Operators classified the submarine type through acoustic signature analysis, identifying it as November, Victor, Charlie, or other class based on characteristic frequencies and patterns. Shore station personnel calculated initial course and speed, predicting where the submarine would transit through the GIUK gap hours later. As the submarine approached the gap, Iceland-based arrays picked up the signature with increasing strength. Refining position and course calculations, data passed to naval facility Keflavik initiated P-3 Orion launch procedures, with aircraft crews preparing to intercept based on predicted submarine position. The P-3 deployed sonobuoy barriers 200 to 400 miles from the last SOSUS update, creating acoustic tripwires the submarine would cross. When sonobuoys detected the submarine, the P-3 crew refined position through additional sonobuoy deployments and maintained contact through passive acoustic tracking. Attack submarines positioned in the area based on SOSUS and P-3 data acquired the Soviet boat on sonar and began shadowing operations that could continue for weeks as the Soviet submarine conducted its patrol. During the 1970s, Soviet Northern Fleet increased submarine operations significantly, attempting in part to overwhelm NATO surveillance through sheer numbers of submarines at sea simultaneously. Soviet planners hoped that even if NATO could track individual submarines, tracking 10 or more boats simultaneously would strain surveillance resources sufficiently that some submarines would evade detection. SOSUS capabilities proved more than adequate for this increased operational tempo. The system routinely tracked 10-plus submarines simultaneously, with different shore stations, monitoring different contacts, and sharing data through Navy communication networks to maintain comprehensive tactical picture. Every Soviet submarine departure was detected and monitored, creating a situation where Soviet confidence in ocean concealment proved unfounded regardless of how many submarines operated at once. The 1980s brought new challenges, as Soviet submarine design emphasized improved acoustic quieting. The Victor III class, deployed beginning in the early 1980s, incorporated substantial quieting improvements, rafted machinery that isolated vibrating equipment from hull structure, improved propeller designs that reduced cavitation noise, and anechoic coatings that absorbed acoustic energy rather than reflecting it. These improvements reduced acoustic signatures by factors of 5 to 10 compared to earlier Soviet submarines, creating detection challenges for SOSUS operators who found that detection ranges decreased from 500 miles to 100 and 200 miles for the quietest Soviet boats. American response to Soviet quieting involved comprehensive upgrades to SOSUS capabilities. New hydrophone arrays with improved sensitivity were deployed to replace earlier systems. Signal processing algorithms were refined to detect fainter signatures more reliably. Additional arrays were positioned to create overlapping coverage that ensured submarines passing beyond detection range of one array would be picked up by another. The investment maintained NATO's detection capability even against quieter Soviet submarines, ensuring that SOSUS continued providing surveillance coverage throughout the 1980s, despite Soviet quieting improvements. The strategic implications of SOSUS surveillance became clear to Soviet naval planners by the mid-1970s, as multiple intelligence sources, including espionage that revealed SOSUS existence, convinced Soviet leadership that NATO tracked their submarines from departure through entire deployments. This realization forced fundamental changes in Soviet submarine doctrine. Rather than confidently breaking out into the Atlantic during conflict, Soviet planners recognized their submarines would be tracked immediately upon departure and shadowed throughout operations. Soviet strategy shifted toward keeping ballistic missile submarines in protected bastion areas, waters near Soviet territory like the Sea of Okhotsk or Barents Sea, where Soviet naval and air forces could provide protection and deny NATO access. Attack submarines would only break out into the Atlantic during wartime, accepting that they would operate under continuous surveillance and that NATO forces would know their positions. The doctrine changes represented fundamental admission that ocean no longer provided concealment Soviet strategy had relied upon. Soviet attempts to develop countermeasures to SOSUS proved largely unsuccessful. Soviet research ships conducted surveys attempting to locate hydrophone arrays, but the arrays were positioned at depths exceeding 1,000 feet in many locations and spread across dozens of miles of ocean floor, making localization extremely difficult and physical neutralization essentially impossible. Soviet submarines experimented with towed noisemakers, devices that generated artificial acoustic signatures to confuse SOSUS, but operators quickly learned to distinguish these deceptions through Doppler analysis that revealed the noise source was being towed rather than self-propelled. Some Soviet submarines attempted to transit very slowly to minimize acoustic signatures, but even slow speed generated enough noise for detection under favorable conditions, and slow transit made submarines vulnerable to other surveillance methods that could detect even quiet boats if given sufficient time. The result of SOSUS capabilities was that Soviet submarine force effectiveness was reduced by an estimated 70 to 80% compared to what it would have been without persistent surveillance. Soviet submarines couldn't threaten Atlantic supply lines credibly because they would be tracked from departure and NATO anti-submarine warfare forces would engage them continuously. Soviet ballistic missile submarines couldn't operate with confidence in their security because SOSUS tracking provided NATO forces with positions that could be exploited during conflict. The enormous Soviet investment in submarine forces, hundreds of boats built, tens of thousands of personnel trained, vast resources devoted to creating credible underwater threat, was substantially neutralized by a surveillance system that Soviet forces couldn't defeat. The reason Soviet forces couldn't counter SOSUS effectively reflected multiple factors including technology, geography, acoustic characteristics, and industrial capability. The technological advantage originated in an American head start. SOSUS development began in 1949 and comprehensive Atlantic coverage was deployed by the mid-1960s, giving American forces nearly 2 decades of operational experience before Soviet forces even understood the system's extent. Soviet attempts to develop similar systems in the 1970s and 1980s failed because Soviet electronics industry could not manufacture hydrophones matching American sensitivity standards. Soviet signal processing capabilities lagged American computer systems by a generation or more, and Soviet acoustic analysis training never matched the expertise American operators developed through continuous operational experience. Geographic advantages favored American and NATO SOSUS deployment fundamentally. The strategic choke points that Soviet submarines needed to transit, GIUK Gap for Atlantic access, straits near Japan for Pacific operations, Gibraltar for Mediterranean access, were all areas where NATO forces could deploy and operate surveillance systems freely. Soviet geography provided no equivalent choke points monitoring American submarine movements, because American submarines could access open ocean directly from bases on both coasts without transiting narrow passages. Soviet Arctic ports were icebound much of the year, limiting operations and creating predictable seasonal patterns. Soviet Pacific ports faced surveillance from American SOSUS arrays positioned near Hawaii, Alaska, and other locations that provided coverage over Soviet submarine transit routes. The acoustic disadvantage. Soviet submarines operated under compounded their surveillance vulnerability. Soviet submarine construction throughout the 1960s and 1970s prioritized performance characteristics like speed, depth capability, and weapons load over acoustic quieting. Soviet design philosophy emphasized building submarines that could engage enemies effectively rather than hiding from them, creating relatively noisy boats that were detectable at long ranges. American submarines, by comparison, incorporated quieting as fundamental design requirement from the beginning, using precision manufacturing to reduce machinery vibration, careful propeller design to minimize cavitation, and rafted equipment to isolate noise sources from hull structures. The manufacturing tolerance differences between American and Soviet construction, American components machined to thousandths of millimeters precision versus Soviet components with hundredths of millimeters precision, created noise level differences measuring factors of 5 to 10 between comparable submarines. Industrial capabilities required for building and maintaining SOSUS systems exceeded Soviet capabilities substantially. The system required precision hydrophone manufacturing. Using specialized materials and techniques Soviet electronics industry couldn't replicate reliably. Shore station electronics needed advanced computers and signal processing systems, where American technology led Soviet equivalents by generations throughout the Cold War. The trained personnel operating SOSUS required education and experience in underwater acoustics, signal analysis, and submarine characteristics that Soviet Navy couldn't match without access to operational system for training. Even after Soviet intelligence learned about SOSUS through espionage in the 1970s, Soviet industry and Navy couldn't build equivalent systems quickly enough to change the strategic situation before Cold War ended. SOSUS operations continued throughout the Cold War, tracking thousands of Soviet submarine transits and providing NATO forces with comprehensive submarine surveillance that shaped naval balance. The system's existence remained highly classified throughout this period, with its full capabilities and deployment only becoming publicly known after declassification in the 1990s. Even Soviet intelligence officers, who learned of SOSUS through espionage, never fully understood its comprehensiveness or the extent to which it compromised Soviet submarine operations. Post-Cold War developments saw SOSUS repurposed for peaceful scientific research. The hydrophone arrays that had tracked submarines proved equally useful for detecting earthquakes, monitoring underwater volcanic activity, and tracking marine mammals. Oceanographers gained access to SOSUS data, using it to study ocean acoustic propagation, detect submarine earthquakes too small for land-based seismographs, and monitor whale populations through their vocalizations. The declassification of SOSUS capabilities and its transition to scientific use demonstrated the technology's versatility beyond its original military purpose. Modern submarine surveillance systems continue SOSUS legacy while incorporating new technologies. Certus, Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, provides mobile surveillance through towed arrays deployed from surface ships, creating flexible coverage that can be positioned anywhere rather than fixed to ocean floor installations. Maritime patrol aircraft like P-8 Poseidon carry advanced sonobuoy systems and signal processing that allow them to detect and track quiet submarines more effectively. Satellites monitor ocean surface looking for subtle disturbances that submarines create, temperature differences from cooling systems, surface wave patterns from submarines transiting shallow depths, even acoustic energy that couples from underwater sources into surface waves detectable from space. Russian Navy acknowledges that SOSUS fundamentally changed submarine warfare, forcing doctrine modifications and driving quieting improvements that continue shaping modern submarine design. Russian submarine development emphasizes acoustic quieting above virtually all other considerations, recognizing that detectability determines survivability more than any other factor. Chinese efforts to build similar underwater surveillance systems in the South China Sea demonstrate recognition that comprehensive ocean surveillance provides decisive advantages, though Chinese acoustic processing capabilities reportedly lag American sophistication substantially. The historical significance of SOSUS extends beyond its direct military contributions to broader implications for ocean transparency. For centuries, oceans provided natural barriers and concealment that shaped naval strategy and tactics. SOSUS demonstrated that technology could render oceans transparent to surveillance, that submarines operating in deep water were no longer invisible, that enormous ocean volumes didn't necessarily prevent detection and tracking across thousand-mile ranges. This transformation paralleled other Cold War surveillance breakthroughs. Satellites that photographed closed societies from space, signals intelligence that intercepted communications across continents, radar that detected aircraft at hundreds of miles. SOSUS specifically addressed underwater domain that seemed impenetrable to surveillance, proving that comprehensive sensor networks could create transparency even in the most challenging environments. When that ocean systems technician in Barbados detected a Soviet November-class submarine 2,800 miles away in November 1968, he participated in surveillance operation that Soviet submarine commander never suspected was occurring. The Soviet crew believed they operated in ocean vastness that provided natural concealment, that once they transited beyond NATO coastal surveillance, they entered areas where detection was unlikely and continuous tracking impossible. They never knew that American hydrophone arrays on the ocean floor detected their acoustic signature from the moment they left port, that shore station operators tracked them across thousands of miles, that their positions were continuously calculated and passed to anti-submarine warfare forces, that an American attack submarine followed them throughout their patrol. The ocean the Soviet crew trusted to hide them had become a fishbowl, where American technology watched their every move, and Soviet submarine force strategy based on ocean concealment had been invalidated by surveillance capabilities Soviet planners never adequately prepared for. Soviet submarines hid in ocean depths. SOSUS turned depths into fishbowl.